A wealthy, childless millionaire decided to adopt a girl from a poor family. The day after her arrival at the mansion, while observing her, the millionaire was stunned and ultimately fainted upon discovering a birthmark on the girl. It was the same mark that everyone in his family had carried for generations. New York City buzzed with its characteristic mid-afternoon frenzy as Henry Thompson left the imposing glass building where he spent most of his days. At 45, he had built a business empire that positioned him among the most influential men in the country. His employees respected him, his partners admired him, and the financial press hailed him as a visionary. However, no one observing him at that moment could guess the emptiness that gnawed at his soul. The chauffeur waited with the door of the black Mercedes open, but Henry, contrary to his usual routine, decided to walk. He needed fresh air, space to think. His steps led him through less busy streets, away from the financial district towards older areas of the city, where modern buildings gave way to colonial constructions and small traditional businesses. The October sun painted the facades in golden hues as Henry walked aimlessly, lost in his thoughts. His Italian shoes resonated against the uneven pavement, marking a rhythm that tried to distract him from the approaching date. Another anniversary, another year without answers. It was then that he saw her for the first time. A small, agile figure, moving among the pedestrians with the grace of someone who knows every corner of the street, like the back of their hand. A girl no older than 12, with black hair tied back in a messy ponytail and worn but clean clothes. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance, but the way she carried herself, with a mixture of caution and determination that seemed out of place in someone so young. The girl stopped in front of a fruit stand, exchanging a few words with the vendor. Henry couldn't hear the conversation, but he noticed how the little one gestured with her hands, expressive and eloquent. The vendor smiled, evidently captivated by the girl's presence. Without knowing exactly why, Henry found himself stopping, observing the scene with a fascination he couldn't explain. There was something in the way the girl moved, in the way her eyes sparkled as she spoke, that felt painfully familiar. The vendor handed the little one an apple, which she received with a smile that lit up her entire face. It was at that moment that their gazes met. The girl's eyes, a deep brown with amber flecks, met Henry's for a fraction of a second. A shiver ran down his spine. The girl seemed to feel something too, because her expression subtly changed. The smile disappeared, replaced by a cautious, almost defensive look. However, she didn't look away. She stood there, holding Henry's gaze with an intensity that seemed to defy her apparent vulnerability. "Sarah?" The vendor's voice broke the moment. "Are you okay, sweetie?" The girl, Sarah, blinked and the spell was broken. With a fluid movement, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Henry with a sense of loss he couldn't comprehend. He stood there, motionless, as the bustle of the city continued around him. His mind was a whirlwind of confused emotions and thoughts. Why had that girl affected him so much? What was it about her that felt so familiar? The vendor was watching him curiously. Henry approached the stand, trying to maintain a casual tone. "Excuse me, that girl, do you know her?" The woman looked at him with a mixture of wariness and compassion. "Sarah comes around here sometimes. She's a good girl, sir. Doesn't cause any trouble. Do you know anything else about her? Where she lives?" "Her family." The vendor shook her head. "Nobody knows much about Sarah, sir. She lives on the streets, but she's different from other kids. She has dignity, you know. She doesn't beg, always looks to earn what she needs. Sometimes she helps me carry the fruit boxes." Henry felt something tighten in his chest. The image of such a young girl living on the streets was unbearable to him, but there was something more, a feeling he couldn't ignore. "Does she come around here often?" "Almost every day, in the afternoon," the vendor replied, studying his face more closely. "But if you're thinking of looking for her, I warn you it's not easy to approach her. Sarah doesn't trust strangers, especially well-dressed men." Henry nodded, understanding the implicit warning in the woman's words. He took out a card from his wallet and handed it to her. "If you see her again, could you call me? I just want to help." The vendor took the card cautiously, her eyes widening slightly as she read the name. "Henry Thompson." "The businessman?" "Yes, that's me," he confirmed with a tired smile, "and I give you my word that my intentions are good." As he walked away from the fruit stand, Henry felt that something had changed in his world. The encounter with Sarah had awakened something in him, a sensation he thought had been dormant for years. For the first time in a long time, he felt he had a purpose beyond his business responsibilities. The sun was beginning to set behind the buildings, tinting the sky in reddish and purple hues. Henry took out his phone and cancelled all his meetings for the next day. He had something more important to do: find a street girl named Sarah, although he still didn't fully understand why that encounter had affected him so much. What he didn't know was that that brief moment on any street in New York City was about to change his life forever. Sarah moved away from the fruit stand with quick but controlled steps, resisting the urge to run. The streets of New York were her home, her school, and her refuge, and she had learned that running only attracted unwanted attention. The apple in her hand was her dinner, a reward for helping Mrs. Johnson with the fruit boxes during the afternoon. As she walked, she couldn't get the image of that elegant man who had looked at her in such a peculiar way out of her mind. It wasn't the first time an adult had observed her with curiosity or pity, but there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't pity she had seen in his eyes, but a kind of recognition, as if he knew her from somewhere. "You're imagining things again, Sarah," she scolded herself softly, turning into a familiar alley that would lead her to her nightly refuge. The sun was setting over the city, and shadows began to lengthen between the buildings. Sarah knew every corner of her territory. She knew which streets to avoid when it got dark, which merchants were kind and which treated her like a nuisance, where to find clean water and where to shelter when it rained. Her current home was an abandoned space between two old buildings, protected from passers-by's view by strategically placed cardboard boxes. She had conditioned the place with the care and creativity that characterized everything she did: an old but clean mattress, some neatly folded blankets, and a plastic box where she kept her few belongings. She sat on the mattress and took out a small broken mirror from her pocket, another of her found treasures. She held it in front of her face, studying her own features as she did every night, looking for clues about her origin in every detail of her reflection. Her eyes, that strange brown color with golden flecks, had always seemed to her the key to some mystery she couldn't decipher. "You have cat eyes," Mrs. Johnson sometimes told her, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if her mother had had the same eyes. The image of the businessman came back to her mind. There had been something in his gaze that had disturbed her, a flash of pain so deep that for a moment she had felt reflected in him. Sarah had learned to read people. It was a necessary skill to survive on the streets. And that man, despite his expensive suit and elegant bearing, carried an invisible weight that she recognized all too well. "It's none of your business," she muttered, putting the mirror away and biting into her apple. But she knew she was lying. Her curiosity, the same that had kept her alive and alert all these years, was already awake. From her treasure box, she took out a worn notebook and a chewed pencil. The notebook was her most prized possession, a gift from a teacher who had tried to convince her to go to school the year before. Although she had rejected the offer of formal education, the notebook had become her confidant. "Day 4380 on the streets, more or less," she wrote in her small, neat handwriting. "Today I saw a man who seemed to know me, though I know it's impossible. He had sad eyes like mine when I look in the mirror. I wonder if he's looking for answers too." She paused for a moment, thoughtful. There was something else, something she didn't dare to write but felt deep within her being. When their gazes had crossed, she had experienced a strange sensation, as if a dormant part of her memory was trying to wake up. A noise in the street alerted her. She quickly put away the notebook and peered cautiously between the cardboard boxes. It was just a stray cat, but Sarah knew she had to stay alert. The night in the city was both her protector and her enemy. She wrapped herself in one of her blankets, lying down on the mattress while listening to the familiar sounds of the nighttime city. The murmur of traffic, distant conversations, music escaping from some nearby window. It had been her lullaby for as long as she could remember. "Who am I?" she whispered to the darkness as she did every night. It was a question that had been etched in her soul since she could remember. She didn't remember her parents, or her first home, or how she had ended up on the streets. Her earliest memories were confused fragments of an orphanage she had escaped from when she was very young, fleeing from something she couldn't even remember clearly. The businessman's face appeared in her mind again. Why had he looked at her like that? And why couldn't she stop thinking about that encounter? Sarah turned on her makeshift bed, trying to push those thoughts away. She had survived all these years by staying away from people, especially adults who promised help. Experience had taught her that most promises were empty. However, as sleep began to overcome her, she couldn't help but wonder if she would see that sad-eyed man again. Something inside her told her that this encounter hadn't been a coincidence, that there was a deeper reason she couldn't yet understand. Tomorrow will be another day, she murmured to herself, her personal survival mantra. But for the first time in a long time, those words carried a different tone, a mixture of apprehension and hope that she didn't dare examine too closely. Night fell over New York City, covering the stories of millions of people with its dark mantle. And in a small corner between two buildings, a 12-year-old girl dreamed of sad eyes and elusive answers, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Henry Thompson's mansion in the Upper East Side stood imposing against the night sky, a modern structure of elegant lines that reflected its owner's success. However, that night, as he crossed the main gate, the businessman felt more than ever the weight of the loneliness that inhabited every corner of that house, too big for one man. The housekeeper, Martha, a woman who had been working for the family for more than 2 decades, greeted him with her usual expression of maternal concern. "Mr. Henry, why didn't you let me know you'd be walking? I could have sent the car," she said, while collecting his jacket. She paused upon noticing his expression. "Is everything all right?" Henry tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "I saw a girl today, Martha," he responded in a quiet voice. "A girl who reminded me so much of—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Martha had been there 12 years ago, had witnessed how little Emily's disappearance had destroyed not only Henry, but also his marriage to Catherine, who couldn't bear the weight of the loss and ended up leaving the country. "Come, I'll prepare you some tea," Martha offered, guiding him towards the kitchen instead of the study where he usually secluded himself. The kitchen was the only space in the house that maintained a certain warmth thanks to Martha's constant presence. As she prepared the tea, Henry sat at the central island, his mind returning again and again to that brief encounter on the street. "She had her eyes, Martha," he murmured after a long silence, "those same amber eyes that Emily had. It's impossible for it to be a coincidence." Martha placed a cup of tea in front of him and sat beside him, something she only allowed herself in moments like this, when the boss needed a friend more than a housekeeper. "Sir, 12 years have passed," she said softly, "and it's not the first time you've thought you've seen the girl somewhere." Henry shook his head. "This time is different. It wasn't just a fleeting resemblance. There was something about her, in her way of moving, in how she looked at me." He ran a hand over his face, frustrated. "The vendor called her Sarah. She lives on the streets, Martha. A girl the age Emily would be, living on the streets." "And what do you plan to do?" Martha asked, already knowing the answer. "I need to find her." "I need to know." He interrupted himself, unable to express exactly what he needed to know. That it was Emily? That he wasn't crazy for clinging for 12 years to the hope of finding her? He got up and walked to the kitchen window, observing the moonlit gardens. "You know what's worse, Martha? That even if it's not her, I can't simply ignore her. She's a child living on the streets. What kind of person would I be if I didn't try to help her?" Martha observed him with a mixture of pride and concern. This was the Henry she knew, the good-hearted man who hid behind the successful businessman. "Have you considered that it could be dangerous to get your hopes up?" she asked delicately. "If it's not Emily—" "I know," Henry interrupted her. "Believe me, I know. But there's something else, something I can't explain." When our gazes met, it was as if time stopped, and I saw in her eyes the same loneliness I feel, the same emptiness I've been carrying for 12 years. He moved away from the window and walked to the refrigerator, where a child's drawing had remained attached with a magnet for more than a decade. It was the last drawing Emily had made in kindergarten, just days before her disappearance. "I cancelled all my meetings for tomorrow," he announced. "I'm going back to that area. I'm going to look for her. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see, but I need to know." Martha stood up and began to clean the kitchen, her way of keeping busy while processing her thoughts. "Do you want me to prepare the child's room?" she finally asked. Henry looked at her surprised. Emily's room had remained untouched for 12 years, like a sanctuary to the hope he had never completely abandoned. "It's too soon for that, Martha." "It's never too soon for hope, sir," she replied with a small smile. "Besides, if that girl lives on the streets, She'll need a safe place sooner or later, whoever she is. Henry felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he didn't know he was holding. Martha was right. Regardless of whether Sarah was Emily or not, she was a child who needed help. And maybe, just maybe, this encounter was destiny giving him a second chance. "Thank you, Martha," he said softly, "for everything." That night, as he tried to sleep in his room, Henry couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about her amber eyes, her defiant posture, the dignity with which she moved despite her evident poverty. Was it possible that fate had put his lost daughter in his path? Or was it just his desperation seeking comfort in a coincidence? Near midnight, he got up and walked to Emily's room. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating toys that were never used, books that were never read, dreams that were interrupted too soon. "I'll find you," he whispered to the empty room. "One way or another. This time, I won't fail you." Dawn found Sarah already awake, as every morning. It was the safest time of day to visit the fountain in the nearby square, where she could wash up before merchants began to arrive. The cold water helped her wake up completely, while her thoughts wandered to the events of the previous day. "Good morning, little early bird," greeted Mr. Pete, the street sweeper who always arrived first to the square. He was one of the few adults Sarah trusted enough to maintain a conversation with. "Good morning, Mr. Pete," she replied, drying her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "How's your knee today?" The old man smiled, leaning on his broom. "Better, thanks to the ointment you brought me, though I still don't understand how you got Mrs. Remedies to give it to you for free." Sarah shrugged, but a small smile played on her lips. "I just helped her organize her storage room. Older people always need help with heavy boxes." Mr. Pete observed her with that mixture of admiration and concern that Sarah had learned to recognize on the faces of those who knew her. "You're too smart to be on the streets, little one. You should be in school with other kids your age." Sarah's smile faded. "I've had enough of schools and orphanages," she muttered, more to herself than to Mr. Pete. The fragmented memories of her early childhood threatened to emerge, but she suppressed them with years of practice, you know. "Yesterday I saw something strange," she said, deliberately changing the subject. "A man in an expensive suit looked at me as if he knew me. He even talked to Mrs. Johnson about me." Mr. Pete stopped sweeping, suddenly alert. "Did he bother you? Because if someone is causing you trouble—" No, Sarah reassured him quickly. "It was different. He seemed sad. And his eyes—" She stopped, unsure how to explain the connection she had felt. The old man observed her carefully. "Be careful, Sarah. The streets can be deceiving, and not everyone who seems good is." "I know," she replied, although part of her mind kept returning to that gaze that seemed to pierce through all her defenses. "I'm always careful." As she walked away from the square, Sarah mentally reviewed her daily routine. First, she would go to the market, where some merchants allowed her to help unload merchandise in exchange for fruit or bread. Later, she might visit the public library, her secret refuge, where the librarian let her read as long as her hands were clean. But today something was different. For the first time in a long time, she felt an unease she couldn't explain. Her thoughts kept returning to that strange encounter, to those eyes that seemed to contain the same void she felt when she thought about her past. She stopped in front of a store window, studying her reflection. Her black hair, though clean, needed a cut. Her features, which she had scrutinized so many times looking for clues about her origin, returned an interrogating look. Where did she come from? Why couldn't she remember anything before the orphanage? A fragmented memory emerged from the depths of her memory. A room with yellow walls, the sound of a lullaby, the aroma of freshly baked cookies. But, as always, the memory slipped through her fingers before she could fully grasp it. "Enough already," she scolded herself. "The past is past. The only thing that matters is the present." But as she walked towards the market, she couldn't help but wonder if she should pass by Mrs. Johnson's stand again that afternoon. Not because she expected to see that man again, she told herself, just because Mrs. Johnson always had work for her, and she needed to earn some money. The morning progressed with her usual routine. She helped unload boxes of vegetables, organized shelves in a grocery store, and even found a lucky coin on the street. However, every time she saw a man in a suit, her heart gave a little jump. "Why did it affect me so much?" she muttered as she sat on a step to count her earnings for the day. "He's just another rich guy who thinks he can fix the world with his money." But even as she spoke these words, she knew she was lying. There was something more to that encounter, something that resonated deep within her being like a forgotten melody. From her pocket, she took out a small silver medallion, the only possession she kept from her unknown past. It was too worn to distinguish the engraving, but she had rubbed it so many times seeking answers that she knew every scratch, every mark on its surface. "Who am I really?" she whispered to the medallion, as she had done thousands of times before. This time, however, the question carried a different weight. The sun was beginning to descend over the city when Sarah made a decision. She would return to Mrs. Johnson's stand, not because she expected to find answers, she told herself, but because she needed to prove that that encounter meant nothing, that it was just another coincidence in a life full of them. What she didn't know was that this seemingly simple decision was about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever. Dawn found Sarah already awake as every morning. It was the safest time of day to visit the fountain in the nearby square, where she could wash up before merchants began to arrive. The cold water helped her wake up completely, while her thoughts wandered to the events of the previous day. "Good morning, little early bird," greeted Mr. Pete, the street sweeper who always arrived first to the square. He was one of the few adults Sarah trusted enough to maintain a conversation with. "Good morning, Mr. Pete," she replied, drying her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "How's your knee today?" The old man smiled, leaning on his broom. "Better, thanks to the ointment you brought me. Though I still don't understand how you got Mrs. Remedies to give it to you for free." Sarah shrugged, but a small smile played on her lips. "I just helped her organize her storage room. Older people always need help with heavy boxes." Mr. Pete observed her with that mixture of admiration and concern that Sarah had learned to recognize on the faces of those who knew her. "You're too smart to be on the streets, little one. You should be in school with other kids your age." Sarah's smile faded. "I've had enough of schools and orphanages," she muttered, more to herself than to Mr. Pete. The fragmented memories of her early childhood threatened to emerge, but she suppressed them with years of practice. "You know? Yesterday I saw something strange," she said, deliberately changing the subject. "A man in an expensive suit looked at me as if he knew me. He even talked to Mrs. Johnson about me." Mr. Pete stopped sweeping, suddenly alert. "Did he bother you? Because if someone is causing you trouble—" No, Sarah reassured him quickly. "It was different. He seemed sad. And his eyes—" She stopped, unsure how to explain the connection she had felt. The old man observed her carefully. "Be careful, Sarah. The streets can be deceiving, and not everyone who seems good is." "I know," she replied, although part of her mind kept returning to that gaze that seemed to pierce through all her defenses. "I'm always careful." As she walked away from the square, Sarah mentally reviewed her daily routine. First, she would go to the market, where some merchants allowed her to help unload merchandise in exchange for fruit or bread. Later, she might visit the public library, her secret refuge where the librarian let her read as long as her hands were clean. But today, something was different. For the first time in a long time, she felt an unease she couldn't explain. Her thoughts kept returning to that strange encounter, to those eyes that seemed to contain the same void she felt when she thought about her past. She stopped in front of a store window, studying her reflection. Her black hair, though clean, needed a cut. Her features, which she had scrutinized so many times looking for clues about her origin, returned an interrogating look. Where did she come from? Why couldn't she remember anything before the orphanage? A fragmented memory emerged from the depths of her memory. A room with yellow walls, the sound of a lullaby, the aroma of freshly baked cookies. But as always, the memory slipped through her fingers before she could fully grasp it. "Enough already," she scolded herself. "The past is past. The only thing that matters is the present." But as she walked towards the market, she couldn't help but wonder if she should pass by Mrs. Johnson's stand again that afternoon. Not because she expected to see that man again, she told herself, just because Mrs. Johnson always had work for her, and she needed to earn some money. The morning progressed with her usual routine. She helped unload boxes of vegetables, organized shelves in a grocery store, and even found a lucky coin on the street. However, every time she saw a man in a suit, her heart gave a little jump. "Why did it affect me so much?" she muttered as she sat on a step to count her earnings for the day. "He's just another rich guy who thinks he can fix the world with his money." But even as she spoke these words, she knew she was lying. There was something more to that encounter, something that resonated deep within her, being like a forgotten melody. From her pocket, she took out a small silver medallion, the only possession she kept from her unknown past. It was too worn to distinguish the engraving, but she had rubbed it so many times seeking answers that she knew every scratch, every mark on its surface. "Who am I really?" she whispered to the medallion, as she had done thousands of times before. This time, however, the question carried a different weight. The sun was beginning to descend over the city when Sarah made a decision. She would return to Mrs. Johnson's stand. Not because she expected to find answers, she told herself, but because she needed to prove that that encounter meant nothing, that it was just another coincidence in a life full of them. What she didn't know was that this seemingly simple decision was about to trigger a series of events that would change her life forever. The afternoon was falling over New York City when Henry returned to the streets where he had seen Sarah the day before. This time he had changed his formal suit for more casual clothes, jeans, a simple shirt, and comfortable shoes. Martha had insisted on the change of wardrobe, arguing that he would attract less attention that way. "Has the girl come back today?" he asked Mrs. Johnson, who was organizing her stand preparing to close. The vendor studied him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Not yet, but she usually passes by at this time. Are you really Henry Thompson? I saw your photo in the newspaper last month." Henry nodded, uncomfortable with the recognition. "Yes, but today I'm not here as a businessman. It's, more personal." Mrs. Johnson seemed to consider his words before speaking. "Sarah is special, Mr. Thompson. She's not like other street kids. She has dignity and she's very intelligent. Sometimes she helps me with the accounts better than my own daughter." "Do you know anything about her past?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite his heart beating strongly. "Little. She never talks about it, but..." The woman lowered her voice. "Once, when she was sick with fever, I let her sleep in my back room. She talked in her sleep about a yellow room and someone singing a lullaby." Henry felt the air leave his lungs. Emily's room had been yellow, and Catherine always sang to her before bed. He had to lean on the stand to keep his balance. "Are you all right, sir?" Mrs. Johnson asked, concerned. Before he could answer, a movement in the corner caught his attention. It was her. Sarah had stopped at the beginning of the street, observing the scene with evident wariness. For a moment it seemed she was going to turn around and disappear, but then something changed in her expression. She lifted her chin in a defiant gesture and began to walk towards them. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," the girl greeted, deliberately ignoring Henry. "Do you need help closing the stand?" "Sarah, I'm glad you came," the vendor responded, casting a significant look at Henry. "Mr. Thompson wanted to talk to you." Sarah's amber eyes finally settled on Henry, studying him with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. "Why?" The question, direct and unpretentious, took Henry by surprise. He had rehearsed this moment all night, but now the words seemed to abandon him. I'd like to help you," he began, aware of how inadequate those words sounded. "I don't need help," Sarah responded automatically, though something in her voice betrayed a doubt. "Especially not from someone who's been looking for me. How did you know I was looking for you?" A small smile appeared on Sarah's lips. "News travels fast on the street. Mr. Pete warned me about you this morning, and the lady from the bakery, and the shoe shiner on the corner." Henry couldn't help but admire her astuteness. "It seems you have good friends looking out for you." "They're my family," she responded with simplicity, but her eyes softened slightly. "The family I chose." Those words hit Henry like a physical punch. How many years had this child been alone, building her own protection network on the streets? "Sarah," he said softly, "have you never wondered about your real family? About your past?" The girl visibly tensed, and for a moment, Henry feared she was going to run away. But then she brought her hand to her pocket, where something seemed to give her strength. "All the time," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But the answers aren't always what we want to hear, are they, Mr. Thompson?" The insight of her response left him speechless. This girl, who had grown up on the streets, showed a wisdom that went beyond her age. "Sometimes," he replied carefully, "the answers are exactly what we need, even if we don't know it at the time." Sarah looked at him for a long time, as if trying to solve a complicated puzzle. Finally, she took something out of her pocket, a worn silver medallion. "Does this mean anything to you?" she asked, extending it towards him but without letting go completely. Henry felt the world stop. He knew that medallion. He had had it specially made for Emily, with an inscription that was now too worn to read. Where did you get it?" he asked with a trembling voice. "It's the only thing I have from before," Sarah replied, studying his reaction. "From before the orphanage, from before everything." The sun was setting over New York City, bathing the scene in golden tones. At that moment, standing on any street, two lost souls were beginning to find their way back home, though neither of them knew it yet. The silence that followed the discovery of the medallion seemed to stretch eternally. Mrs. Johnson, perceiving the intensity of the moment, discreetly began to tidy her stand, giving them space but staying close enough for Sarah to feel safe. "That medallion," Henry began, struggling to keep his voice steady, "has an inscription on the back. Or it did." Sarah nodded slowly. "It's very worn now. You can barely see some letters. An E and I think an M." "Emily Marie," Henry whispered, and this time he couldn't contain the tremor in his voice. Is my daughter's name." Sarah's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Years on the street had taught her not to trust coincidences easily. "A lot of people are named Emily," she said cautiously, though her hand gripped the medallion more tightly. "And Marie isn't an uncommon middle name. The medallion is shaped like a crescent moon," Henry continued, taking a cautious step forward. "And in the center there was a small five-pointed star." Sarah visibly paled. Those details couldn't be a coincidence. The star, though worn, was still visible on the medallion, a detail she had never shared with anyone. "How?" she began, but her voice broke. She swallowed and tried again. "How did you lose your daughter?" The question hit Henry like a wave of cold water. For years he had avoided talking about that day, but now the words came out as if they had been waiting for this moment. "It was 12 years ago. Emily was barely a few months old. It was an afternoon like any other. Her mother had gone out to the garden for a moment, and when she returned..." He stopped, breathing deeply. "When she returned, the crib was empty." Sarah listened intently, her face a mask of concentration. "Was the crib next to a window? A window with yellow curtains?" Henry felt his knees weaken. "Yes," he whispered. "How do you know?" "I dream about that room," Sarah responded, her voice barely audible. "With yellow curtains swaying in the wind, and someone singing a song, a lullaby. 'Sleep, my child, sleep, my son,'" Henry sang softly, and he saw Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "Sleep, piece of my heart," she completed automatically, and then brought a hand to her mouth, surprised by her own words. Mrs. Johnson, who had been observing the scene in silence, couldn't contain a sob. Sarah took a step back, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. "This doesn't mean anything," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "It could be a coincidence." "Sarah," Henry said gently, "look me in the eyes. You have the same eyes as your mother, the same ones my Catherine had, with that golden sparkle that seems to change with the light." The girl unconsciously brought a hand to her face, as if she could touch the color of her own eyes. For years that distinctive feature had been both her pride and her mystery. If it were true," she said slowly, "why did you never find me? Why did I spend years in that orphanage? Why did I have to escape and live on the streets?" The pain in her voice was palpable, and Henry had to resist the urge to hug her. He knew any sudden movement could scare her. "We looked for you," he responded fervently. "I hired private investigators, offered rewards, we checked every orphanage in the city, but it was like you had vanished into thin air." "Which orphanage were you in?" "St. Angel's," she replied, "but not with that name. They called me Mary, just Mary. I didn't have a last name." Henry closed his eyes for a moment. St. Angel's orphanage had been on his list, but when they visited, they were told they had no girl matching Emily's description. "Someone took you there," he said, more to himself than to her. "Someone who wanted to make sure we wouldn't find you." A shiver ran down Sarah's back. The fragmented memories of her first years in the orphanage began to take on new meaning. "The woman in grey," she murmured. "There was always a woman dressed in grey who came to see me. The nuns said she was my aunt, but she never spoke to me. She just observed me from afar." Henry felt his heart stop. "An older woman? With a small scar near her left eyebrow?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. "You know her?" "Louise," Henry said, and for the first time, Sarah detected a tone of anger in his voice. "My cousin. She always had resentment towards our family, but I never imagined she would go so far." The sun had completely disappeared, leaving the street illuminated only by street lamps and the lights from nearby businesses. Mrs. Johnson lit the small lamp on her stand, creating a circle of warm light around them. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, and for the first time Henry could hear in her voice the 12-year-old girl she was, beyond her facade of toughness. "That depends on you," he replied softly. "I can't force you to do anything, and I understand if you need time to process all of this, but I want you to know that your home is waiting for you. It has always been waiting for you." Night had completely fallen over New York City when Mrs. Johnson finally intervened. "It's getting chilly," she said in her maternal tone, "and these conversations aren't for having on the street. Why don't you both come to my house? It's only 2 blocks from here." Sarah looked at the vendor with gratitude. Mrs. Johnson represented safe ground, a neutral point between her life on the streets and the revelations that threatened to change her entire world. "I don't want to cause you any trouble," Henry began, but the woman interrupted him with a gesture. "It's no trouble. Besides, Sarah has dinner with me at least twice a week. Isn't that right, sweetie?" The girl nodded, allowing herself a small smile. It was true. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, after helping close the stand, Mrs. Johnson always insisted that she stay for dinner. "All right," she finally agreed, looking at Henry, "but on one condition. I want you to tell me everything. About my mother, about that woman Louise, about me." The walk to Mrs. Johnson's house was silent. Sarah walked between the 2 adults, aware of each step she took, as if she were crossing an invisible bridge between her past and her future. The house was small but cozy, with walls painted in bright colors and potted plants in every corner. The aroma of freshly made coffee and hot tortillas filled the air. "Sit down," Mrs. Johnson indicated, heading to the kitchen. "I'll prepare something to eat while you talk." Sarah sat on the old floral sofa, hugging her knees to her chest in a protective gesture. Henry took a seat in a nearby chair, respecting her space. "Your mother's name is Catherine," he began softly. "She is a music teacher. She has a beautiful voice. She sang to you every night, even before you were born." "Where is she now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In London. After your disappearance, the pain was too much for her. She needed to get away from everything that reminded her of you." Henry paused. "But she never stopped looking for you. Every year on your birthday, she publishes an ad in the newspapers with your baby photo." Sarah processed this information in silence. Her fingers unconsciously played with the medallion, as she always did when she was nervous. "And Louise? Why did she do it?" Henry sighed deeply. "Louise is complicated. She always felt the family had treated her unfairly. My father, your grandfather, was the family patriarch and always favored my branch of the family over hers. When I inherited the company and the family fortune, her resentment grew. So she stole me for revenge." Sarah's voice had an edge of pain and anger. "I think it was more than that," Henry replied carefully. "Louise could never have children of her own. Perhaps in her distorted mind, she thought she deserved to have you more than we did." Mrs. Johnson returned with a tray of sandwiches and 3 cups of hot chocolate. "Eat something," she insisted. "Sorrows with bread are less sorrows." Sarah took a sandwich mechanically, but didn't try it. Her mind was processing all the information, trying to reconcile her fragments of memory with this new reality. "At the orphanage," she said slowly, "there was a nun, Sister Mary Grace. She was the one who gave me the name Mary, but sometimes, when she thought I couldn't hear her, she called me Emily and cried." Henry leaned forward, interested. "Do you think she knew?" "Maybe. But when I was 6 and I asked her why she called me that, she got very scared. The next day she was no longer at the orphanage. They said she had been transferred to another convent." "Louise must have found out," Henry murmured. "She must have intervened to keep the secret." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Cars passing, dogs barking, life following its normal course, while in that small living room 3 people dealt with life-changing truths. "What do you want to do now, Sarah?" Mrs. Johnson asked softly. The girl looked up from her untouched sandwich, her amber eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "I don't know," she admitted. "All of this, it's too much. For years I dreamed of finding my family, but now that it's happening..." She paused, searching for the right words. "The streets are hard, but I understand them. I know how to survive here. But that other life, that life with a family and a house and a last name, it scares me." "I understand," Henry said gently, "and I'm not asking you to make a decision now. We can take it step by step." Sarah looked at him for a long time, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. "And what if I'm not what you expect? What if I can't be the daughter you lost?" The question hit Henry like a physical punch. "Sarah," he said with a broken voice, "I don't expect you to be anyone other than yourself. You've survived alone for years. You've built your own life. That shows more strength and character than anything I could have expected." The night advanced as the conversation continued in Mrs. Johnson's small living room. The hot chocolate had gone cold in the cups, a silent witness to the emotions flowing between father and daughter. "I have a proposal," Henry finally said after a long silence. "I'm not asking you to come live with me immediately. But what do you think if we start with small steps? We could see each other every day, talk, get to know each other better." Sarah considered the proposal, biting her lower lip in an unconscious gesture. "And where would we meet?" "Here," Mrs. Johnson intervened naturally. "My house can be a neutral point. You can come at dinner time like today. And during the day," Henry continued, "you could consider the idea of resuming your studies. I know a school near here." "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I'm not ready for that. The last time I was in a school..." She stopped, the memories clearly painful. "Okay," Henry quickly conceded. "No school for now, but what about a private tutor? Someone who could come here to Mrs. Johnson's house if she agrees." The vendor nodded with a smile. "Of course, this house is always open for you, sweetie. You know that." Sarah played with the medallion, considering the proposal. "And will I be able to keep seeing my friends? Mr. Pete, the bakery lady, the shoe shiner?" "Of course," Henry replied sincerely. "They have been your family when I couldn't be. I would never ask you to abandon them." Something in Sarah's face relaxed slightly. "And my mother. Will you tell her you found me?" Henry visibly tensed. It was a question he had been asking himself. "I think we should wait a little. Not because she doesn't have the right to know, but because she deserves more than a phone call. And you deserve time to adapt to these changes before facing more emotions." Sarah nodded, apparently relieved by the answer. "One more thing," she said, straightening on the sofa. "I want to know more about Louise. Not to see her," she quickly added upon seeing Henry's expression, "but to understand. I need to know why she did what she did." "I'll tell you everything I know," Henry promised. "But there's something you should know first. Louise isn't in New York now. After what happened, she moved to Europe. I have people watching her to make sure she can't hurt you again." A thoughtful silence fell over the room. Outside, the night had enveloped the city in its dark mantle, but the lights from neighboring houses created a cozy atmosphere. "All right," Sarah finally said. "I accept. We can meet here, talk, get to know each other better, but with one more condition." "Anything you want," Henry immediately responded. "I don't want you to pressure me to go to your house or to call you Dad. I need time to process all of this, to be sure." Henry felt his heart tighten, but he understood the wisdom in his daughter's words. "Of course. Everything will be at your pace, Sarah, I promise." Mrs. Johnson, who had been observing the exchange in silence, stood up and began to collect the cups. "It's late," she said softly. "Sarah, why don't you stay and sleep here tonight? I have your usual room ready." The girl looked at the vendor with gratitude. The idea of returning to her refuge on the street that night, with so many emotions and thoughts spinning in her head, scared her a little. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," she said quietly. Henry stood up, understanding it was time to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, trying to keep a casual tone. Sarah nodded. "I'll be here. And, she hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Thank you for respecting my conditions." "I always will," Henry promised. "Good night, Sarah." As he walked to his car, parked a few blocks away, Henry felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions. He had found his daughter, but the road ahead was long and delicate. One wrong step could push her away forever. He took out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Martha?" "Yes, I found her." "It's her, Martha. My Emily, my Sarah, and she's stronger and braver than I ever imagined. That night, in the small room that Mrs. Johnson always kept ready for her, Sarah couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling while her mind went over the day's events again and again. The medallion rested in her open palm, its worn surface gleaming faintly under the moonlight filtering through the window. "Emily Marie Thompson," she whispered in the darkness, testing how her real name sounded. It sounded strange, foreign, like a dress that didn't quite fit right. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Are you awake, sweetie?" Mrs. Johnson's voice was soft, maternal. "Yes, come in." The woman entered with a steaming cup in her hands. "I brought you some chamomile tea. It helps you sleep." Sarah sat up, accepting the cup gratefully. Mrs. Johnson sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment both remained in comfortable silence. "What do you really think of all this?" the girl finally asked. Mrs. Johnson considered the question for a moment. "I think destiny has mysterious ways of working. I've known you for years, Sarah, and I always knew you were special. There was something about you, a light that didn't match your life on the streets. Do you think I should trust him?" "I think you already do, even if it scares you to admit it," Mrs. Johnson replied with a soft smile. "I saw how you looked at him while he talked about your mother, about your past. Your eyes shone with the same recognition I saw in his." Sarah took a sip of tea, letting the warmth of the drink comfort her. "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "Not of Mr. Thompson, of Henry, but of everything it means. What if I can't be part of that world? What if people realize I'm just a street kid?" "Look at me, Sarah," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "You have never been just anything. You are intelligent, strong, and you have more dignity than many people I know with money and important last names. You don't need to change who you are, you just need to allow yourself to be who you've always been." The woman's words touched something deep in Sarah's heart. Tears she had been holding back all day began to fall silently. "The strange thing is," she said between sobs, "when I look at him, when I hear his voice, there's something that feels right. As if a part of me that I didn't know was lost had finally found its place." Mrs. Johnson hugged her, allowing the girl to release all the pent-up emotions. "That's called blood, sweetie. It's the heart recognizing what the mind is still processing." When the sobs finally calmed down, Sarah separated from the hug and wiped her tears with the sleeve of her borrowed pajamas. "You know what's strangest?" she said with a small smile. "All my life I've dreamed of finding my family, of having answers about who I am, and now that I have them, all I can think about is how much I'm going to miss helping at your fruit stand." Mrs. Johnson laughed softly. "Silly girl, who said you're going to stop helping me? I need someone who knows how to count change correctly. Besides," she added with a wink, "who else is going to keep me informed about all the street gossip?" For the first time all day, Sarah laughed genuinely. It was a light, youthful sound that reminded that beneath all her toughness and forced maturity, she was still a 12-year-old girl. "What if everything goes wrong?" she asked after a moment, worry returning to her voice. "What if everything goes right?" Mrs. Johnson countered. "Sometimes, sweetie, true courage isn't in surviving the bad, but in allowing ourselves to experience the good." Sarah considered these words as she finished her tea. The warmth of the drink and the emotional exhaustion of the day were beginning to take effect. "Thank you," she said as she settled back into bed. "For everything." "Rest, my child," Mrs. Johnson replied, tucking her in as she had done so many other nights. "Tomorrow is a new day, and you have a whole life ahead of you to discover who you really are." As the woman left the room, Sarah clutched the medallion to her chest. For the first time in a long time, the dreams that visited her that night were not nightmares about her lost past, but blurry visions of a yellow room, a soft lullaby, and the face of a man looking at her with eyes full of love and hope. Henry could barely sleep that night. In his study, surrounded by old photographs and documents, he tried to reconstruct the puzzle of the last 12 years. His mind kept revolving around one central thought. Louise couldn't have acted alone. "Sir," Martha's voice startled him. He hadn't realized dawn was breaking. "I brought you coffee, and you need to rest a bit." "Thank you, Martha. But there's something that doesn't add up." Henry ran a hand over his tired face. To carry out a plan like this, Louise needed help. Someone inside the orphanage, someone who could handle documents. "Are you thinking about Mr. Alfred?" Henry looked up sharply. "Why do you mention Alfred?" Because, Martha hesitated for a moment before continuing, he was in charge of corporate donations to orphanages at that time, including St. Angel's. A sudden memory hit Henry. The board meeting where annual donations were decided, Alfred insisting on maintaining support for certain specific orphanages, his strange reaction when Henry suggested changing the beneficiary institutions. "I need to make some calls," he said, standing up abruptly. "And I need you to prepare Sarah's room. We don't know when she'll want to see it, but it should be ready." As Martha left to carry out his request, Henry dialed a number on his phone. "Michael, I know it's early, but I need you to investigate something. I want everything you can find about the connections between Alfred Bennett and St. Angel's Orphanage, specifically from 12 years ago." The morning advanced as Henry continued his investigation. Each new piece of data seemed to confirm his suspicions. Alfred had been involved in Louise's plan from the beginning. A text message interrupted his thoughts. "Good morning, it's Sarah. Mrs. Johnson lent me her phone. Are we still meeting this afternoon?" Henry smiled as he read the message. It was formal, cautious, but the simple fact that she had taken the initiative to contact him meant a lot. "Of course. Would you like to have lunch? We could go wherever you want." The response came almost immediately. "I know a place. It's small, but the food is good. Mrs. Johnson says she can join us if you want." "Sounds perfect to me." "At Toussaint?" "Okay." Henry looked at the exchange of messages, noticing how even in so few words his daughter's personality was reflected. Practical, direct, but with a touch of consideration in including Mrs. Johnson as a point of support. The sound of the phone ringing pulled him out of his reflections. It was Michael. "Mr. Thompson, I found something interesting. 12 years ago, right after your daughter's disappearance, there was a significant transfer of funds from a Swiss account to St. Angel's Orphanage. The account was in the name of a shell company, but we've traced the digital signature. It was Alfred Bennett." Henry felt his blood run cold. "How much?" $5 million. "And there's more. The Mother Superior of the orphanage at that time, who curiously retired shortly after, bought a house in the Hamptons, a house she couldn't have afforded on her salary. I need those documents, Michael. All of them. I'm already sending them to your email. Sir, may I ask why we're investigating this now?" Henry hesitated for a moment. "I found her, Michael. I found Emily." The silence on the other end of the line was eloquent. Michael had been part of the original search team 12 years ago. "Are you sure?" "Completely. And now I need to understand exactly what happened. Not just for justice, but because she deserves to know the whole truth." "Count on me for whatever you need," Michael responded firmly. After hanging up, Henry stared at the photographs on his desk. One in particular caught his attention: the last Christmas party at the company before Emily's disappearance. In it, Alfred smiled next to Louise, both holding champagne glasses. How had he not seen it before? The clock marked 1:30. He would have to leave the investigation for later. Now the most important thing was to build a relationship with his daughter. The dark truths of the past could wait. The present was too precious to waste. As he prepared to leave, Henry promised himself that this time he would protect his daughter not only from obvious dangers, but also from the shadows that had been lurking in the corners of his own life for all these years. The small diner, Jenny's Place, was one of the neighborhood's best-kept secrets. Located in a narrow alley, with just 6 tables and modest decor, the place survived thanks to its excellent cooking and the loyalty of its regular customers. Sarah was already there when Henry arrived, sitting next to Mrs. Johnson at a corner table. She wore the same clothes as the day before, but her hair was freshly washed and neatly braided. "Jenny makes the best chicken pot pie in the city," Sarah said by way of greeting when Henry sat down. "And I'm not just saying that because she sometimes lets me wash dishes in exchange for food." The naturalness with which she mentioned her way of surviving on the streets made something tighten in Henry's chest. But before he could respond, an older woman approached the table. "Sarah," she exclaimed with genuine affection, "I didn't know you'd be coming today." "And who is this elegant gentleman?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then responded with a firm voice. "He's my father, Jenny." The silence that followed those words was eloquent. It was the first time Sarah had openly acknowledged him as her father. Your father?" Jenny looked alternately at Sarah and Henry, clearly confused. It's a long story, Mrs. Johnson intervened softly. Why don't you bring us 3 orders of your famous pot pie, and maybe some of that lemonade Sarah likes so much? As Jenny walked away, still casting curious glances towards the table, Sarah nervously played with her napkin. I hope you don't mind that I introduced you that way, she finally said without looking up. It's just that, well, Jenny has always been good to me and lying to her doesn't feel right. I feel honored, Henry responded sincerely, and grateful to all the people who have taken care of you when I couldn't. The tension in Sarah's shoulders seemed to relax a bit. I've been thinking, she said after a moment, about what you said yesterday about the tutor. Yes? Maybe we could try it, but here, in the neighborhood, and only in the mornings. In the afternoons I help at various stands, and I don't want to stop doing that. Of course, Henry responded quickly. We can adapt everything to your schedule. In fact, he added with a smile, I know an excellent teacher who could be perfect for you. She's patient, understanding, and has experience working with students who need a more personalized approach. What's her name? Caroline Owens. She's an old family friend, in fact. Henry paused, considering whether he should continue. She was the one who taught music to your mother. Sarah's eyes lit up with interest. My mother? The one who's a music teacher? Yes. Catherine, your mother, was one of her most talented students. Later, she became a teacher herself. The arrival of the food interrupted the conversation. The chicken pot pies were exquisitely presented, the golden crust contrasting with the creamy filling. It smells delicious, murmured Sarah with a small smile, repeating something she had clearly heard from Jenny before. As they ate, the conversation flowed more naturally. Sarah told stories about her different jobs in the neighborhood, how she helped the baker organize the breads in the morning, how she had learned to recognize the best fruits working with Mrs. Johnson, how the shoe shiner had taught her to repair shoes. Henry listened attentively, marveling at his daughter's resilience and initiative. Each story revealed not only her ingenuity to survive, but also her ability to build meaningful relationships with the people around her. What about you? Sarah suddenly asked. What exactly do you do in your company? Well, Henry adjusted in his chair, thinking about how to explain his work simply. We mainly focus on developing technology to make buildings more efficient and environmentally friendly, solar energy systems, water treatment, that kind of thing. Like making buildings greener? Exactly. In fact, he added with a smile, it was your mother who inspired me to focus the company in that direction. She always said we should leave a better world for you. A reflective silence fell over the table. Sarah absorbed this new information about her parents, about the world she came from, trying to reconcile it with the world she knew. Do you think, she began hesitantly, do you think I'll be able to meet her someday, my mother? When you're ready, Henry responded gently. There's no rush. We can go step by step at your pace. Sarah nodded, grateful for the understanding. As they finished dessert, a homemade apple pie that Jenny insisted on bringing them on the house, the girl seemed to be making an internal decision. Okay, she finally said. I'd like to meet that teacher, Caroline Owens. Maybe she can tell me more about my mother while she teaches me. Caroline Owens lived in an old house in Brooklyn, surrounded by books and sheet music. At 65, she was still an imposing presence, with her grey hair always pulled back in an elegant bun and those vivacious eyes that seemed to see directly into people's souls. When Henry explained the situation to her over the phone, there was a long silence followed by a muffled sob. Bring her tomorrow, was her only response. So there they were the next day, Sarah and Henry in front of Caroline's green door. Sarah carried a small backpack with some notebooks that Mrs. Johnson had given her, and her expression oscillated between curiosity and apprehension. Are you sure you want to do this today? Henry asked softly. Sarah nodded. Yes. But, she hesitated for a moment. Will you stay nearby? I'll be at the cafe on the corner. If you need anything at all, just tell Caroline, and I'll come immediately. Before they could ring the doorbell, the door opened. Caroline Owens stood motionless in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Sarah. For a moment it seemed she was going to hug the girl, but she held back, noticing her cautious posture. Welcome, she said instead, her voice warm but controlled. Please, come in. The interior of the house was like a cozy museum. Books stacked on every available surface, plants in the windows, and in the center of the living room, a black grand piano that shone under the natural light coming through the large windows. Sarah couldn't help but approach the instrument, her fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "Do you like music?" Caroline asked, watching her carefully. "Sometimes," Sarah paused as if hesitating to share something personal. "Sometimes when I pass by music stores, I stop to listen, and there's a melody that's always in my head, although I don't know where it comes from." Caroline exchanged a significant look with Henry. "Could you hum it?" Sarah hesitated but then began to hum softly. It was a simple but beautiful melody, and both Caroline and Henry recognized it immediately. It was the lullaby that Catherine used to sing to her when she was a baby. Caroline sat at the piano and delicately began to play the melody. Sarah started, her eyes widening in surprise. "That's it. How—" "Your mother," Caroline explained softly, "composed this song for you when you were in her womb. She called it Emily's Lullaby." Sarah unconsciously brought a hand to her chest, where the medallion rested under her clothes. "My mother wrote it." "Yes. Catherine always had a special gift for music. When she told me she was pregnant, the first thing she did was compose this lullaby. She played it every night during her pregnancy, and after when you were born. She sang it to put me to sleep," Sarah completed in a whisper, a fragmented memory emerging in her mind. Henry, who had been observing the scene in silence, cleared his throat. "Maybe I should leave you to begin the lesson." "Yes, of course," said Caroline, regaining her professional composure. "How about we start by evaluating where you are in different subjects, Sarah? That way we can create a study plan adapted to your needs." Sarah nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the piano. "I'll be at the cafe," Henry reminded, heading to the door. He paused for a moment, observing his daughter, who was now sitting next to Caroline in front of some books. It was strange how in just a few days his world had taken such a dramatic turn. As he walked towards the cafe, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Michael. "Mr. Thompson, I found something else about Alfred. We need to talk." Henry looked towards Caroline's house. Through the window, he could see Sarah leaning over a notebook, listening attentively to something Caroline was explaining. For now, he decided, the secrets of the past could wait. This moment, seeing his daughter beginning to rebuild her life, was more important than any revenge or justice. "This afternoon," he replied to Michael. For now, his priority was to be available in case Sarah needed him. He sat in the cafe with his laptop, trying to work, but finding himself constantly looking towards Caroline's house. Each time he did, a mixture of emotions overwhelmed him: gratitude for having found his daughter, rage for the lost years, and an iron determination to protect her from now on. The melody of the lullaby kept resonating in his mind, a bittersweet reminder of all they had lost and all that perhaps they could recover. Meanwhile, in the cafe on the corner, Henry was receiving disturbing information from Michael through a phone call. "Mr. Thompson, I reviewed Alfred's financial records from the last 12 years. There's an interesting pattern. Every year on the same date, he makes a substantial transfer to an account in the Cayman Islands. Does the date coincide with—" "Yes, sir. With the day of your daughter's disappearance." Henry gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Hush money," he murmured. "It seems so. And there's more. The Mother Superior who ran the orphanage at that time, Sister Mary Angela, died 3 months ago under strange circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" "Officially, natural causes. But 2 days before, she had contacted an investigative journalist. They never got to meet." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. "And the journalist?" "Left the country suddenly. Now lives in Argentina." "But—" Michael made a significant pause. He left a sealed envelope in his editor's office. An envelope that was only to be opened if something happened to him. "I need that envelope, Michael." "I'm already on it, sir. But there's something else you should know. Alfred has been making strange moves in the company. He's called an extraordinary board meeting for next week." Henry looked out the window towards Caroline's house, where his daughter was still having her lesson. "He wants to take advantage of me being distracted with Sarah to make some move in the company." "It seems so. Do you want me to take any preventive measures?" "Not yet. First, I need to understand exactly what happened 12 years ago. And why." After hanging up, Henry stared at his now cold coffee. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming an increasingly dark picture. Alfred hadn't just helped Louise with the kidnapping. He had used the situation to gain power in the company, while Henry was devastated by the loss of his daughter. His phone vibrated with a message from Caroline. The lesson is over. There's something you need to know. When Henry entered Caroline's house, he found Sarah sitting at the piano, tentatively touching the keys with one finger, producing loose notes that seemed to be searching for a lost melody. "How was the lesson?" he asked, trying to maintain a casual tone despite the tension he felt. "Good," Sarah responded, turning to look at him. "Caroline says I learn quickly." "She has a brilliant mind," Caroline confirmed, "and an exceptional memory." Something in Caroline's tone made Henry look at her carefully. There was a hidden message in her words. "Would you like to continue with the lessons?" he asked Sarah. The girl nodded, but there was something different in her expression, a shadow of concern that wasn't there before. "Caroline says I could learn to play the piano too, like my mother." The way she said "my mother" made Henry's heart clench. There was so much longing in those two words. "Catherine would be delighted," he said softly. "She always dreamed of teaching you music." A silence laden with meaning filled the room. Sarah seemed to want to say something more, but held back, casting furtive glances at Caroline. "How about we go get something to eat?" Caroline suggested, breaking the tension. "I know a place nearby that makes delicious sandwiches." As they walked towards the deli, Henry noticed that Caroline and Sarah exchanged significant looks, as if sharing a secret. His instinct told him that something important had happened during the lesson, something they weren't ready to share with him yet. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said suddenly, as they waited for their food to be served. "Anything you want." "Why does Alfred Bennett still work at your company?" The question took Henry by surprise. "How do you know that name?" Sarah played with her napkin, avoiding his gaze. "I heard it before at the orphanage." Henry felt his heart race, but kept his voice controlled. "Did you see him there?" "Maybe we should talk about this another time," Caroline intervened, noticing the growing tension. "No," Sarah said firmly. "I need to know. We need to know, because he wasn't alone, was he? There were more people involved." Her words confirmed Henry's suspicions. The circle of conspiracy was wider than he had initially imagined. The deli was almost empty at that time of the afternoon, which provided them with the privacy necessary for such a delicate conversation. The sandwiches steamed on their plates untouched, as the tension grew in the air. "You're right," Henry finally said, looking directly at his daughter. "Alfred didn't act alone, but I need you to tell me exactly what you remember about him at the orphanage." Sarah took a sip of water, as if she needed time to order her thoughts. "He came once a month, always in a dark suit. The nuns treated him like he was someone very important. But there was something in the way he looked at me that scared me." "Did he talk to you?" "Not directly, but once—" Sarah closed her eyes, straining to remember. "Once I heard him arguing with the Mother Superior. He was angry because she wanted more money. He said something about the original deal being enough." Caroline and Henry exchanged significant looks. "Do you remember anything else from that conversation?" Caroline asked gently. "The Mother Superior mentioned something about documents. She said keeping secrets was expensive." Sarah opened her eyes, and there was a fierce determination in them. "And she mentioned a name, Alexandra." Henry visibly tensed. "Alexandra Vega?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. "You know her?" "She was Alfred's secretary at that time," Henry replied, his mind working quickly. "She resigned suddenly shortly after your disappearance. We all assumed she had moved abroad." "But she didn't, did she?" Caroline intervened. "No," Henry confirmed. "She stayed in New York but changed her identity. Michael found her living in Queens under another name." "Was she involved too?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I think she was the link between Alfred and the orphanage," Henry explained. "The person who made sure all the documents looked legitimate." Sarah played with her medallion, a gesture that Henry had noticed she did when she was processing difficult information. "Why did they hide me for so long?" she finally asked. "Why not just make me disappear? Why keep me in the orphanage?" The question hit Henry like a physical punch. The idea that his daughter would consider that they could have hurt her more severely turned his stomach. "I think," said Caroline, carefully choosing her words, "they needed you as a form of control. While you were alive but hidden, they had power over your father." "Control for what?" "The company," Henry responded, the pieces finally fitting in his mind. "Every time I tried to make significant changes in the direction of the company, Alfred found ways to block it. And always, coincidentally, I would receive photos of you shortly after. Photos where you could be seen in the orphanage, but never clear enough to fully identify you. It was their insurance, Sarah murmured. Their way of keeping you under control without you knowing it. But something went wrong, Caroline continued. You escaped from the orphanage. Yes, Sarah confirmed, and for the first time, a small smile of pride crossed her face. They couldn't control what they couldn't find. Why did you escape? Henry asked softly. Sarah's smile disappeared. There was a new nun, Sister Teresa. She treated me differently. She called me by another name when she thought no one was listening. One day I heard her arguing with the Mother Superior, saying that what they were doing was a sin. The next morning, Sister Teresa was gone. And I knew I had to leave. You were very brave, said Caroline, taking the girl's hand. I was scared, Sarah admitted, but I was more scared of staying. There was something wrong in that place, something I didn't understand but could feel. And now, said Henry, his voice laden with determination, we need to make sure they pay for what they did. No, Sarah interrupted firmly, surprising both adults. Not yet. First we need to find the evidence, all the documents, all the connections. Because if we fail to catch them, she left the sentence unfinished, but the message was clear. Henry looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. At 12 years old, she showed an understanding of the situation that many adults would envy. You're right, he conceded. We need to be smart about this, but promise me something. What? That you'll let me protect you. No more secrets between us. If you remember something, if you see something suspicious, you'll tell me immediately. Sarah looked at him for a long time before nodding. Only if you promise the same. No more solo investigations. We're in this together. Together, Henry confirmed, and for the first time since they had found each other, he felt they were truly beginning to be a family. The following days established a new routine. Every morning, Sarah attended her classes with Caroline, where she not only advanced quickly in her basic studies, but had also begun to take piano lessons. Her fingers, accustomed to hard work on the streets, were slowly finding the softness necessary to caress the keys. In the afternoons, she divided her time between helping at the neighborhood stands and spending time with Henry, who had reorganized his entire schedule to be available for her. Mrs. Johnson's house remained their main meeting point, her home converted into a safe haven where father and daughter could build their relationship step by step. It was a particularly hot afternoon when Sarah, while helping Mr. Pete sweep the square, noticed something strange. Mr. Pete, she called in a low voice, do you see that man on the corner? The one in the grey suit? The old street sweeper looked discreetly in the indicated direction. I've seen him around here before for a few days now. He's watching us, Sarah murmured. And it's not the first time. Mr. Pete gripped his broom tightly. Do you want me to call your father? The word father still sounded strange, but Sarah nodded. In recent days, she had learned to trust Henry's protective instinct. As Mr. Pete walked away to make the call from the public phone in the square, Sarah continued sweeping, pretending normalcy, but keeping the man in her peripheral vision. Years on the street had taught her to always be alert, without appearing to be so. The man in the grey suit was talking on the phone, and although he was too far away to hear the conversation, his body language denoted tension. Henry arrived in less than 10 minutes, which pleasantly surprised Sarah. A part of her still expected to be disappointed by adults, but he was proving to be different. Where is he? He asked in a low voice after casually greeting Mr. Pete. He left a few minutes ago, Sarah responded, but I took a picture with Mr. Pete's phone. Henry looked at the blurry image on the old cell phone. Despite the quality, the man's face was clearly visible. It's Roger Mendez, he said with a grim expression, Alfred's personal assistant. Do you think he was watching me? I don't think so, I'm sure. Henry ran a hand over his face, clearly worried. Alfred must know I found you. What do we do now? The question was left hanging in the air when Henry's phone vibrated with a message from Michael. I have the envelope. It's worse than we thought. Sarah, who had read the message over her father's shoulder, exchanged a significant look with him. We need a safe place to meet, Henry said. The public library, Sarah suggested immediately. There's a study room on the second floor that no one uses at this time. The librarian lets me use it when I need a quiet place to read. Henry couldn't help a small smile at the mention of the safe places his daughter had found during her years on the street. Each new detail he discovered about her showed her intelligence and resourcefulness. Well thought out, he nodded. "I'll tell Michael to meet us there in an hour." As they walked to the library, Sarah noticed that Henry kept a protective hand near her back, not touching her, but close enough to react if something happened. It was a gesture that, surprisingly, didn't make her uncomfortable. "Henry," she said softly as they climbed the library stairs. "Yes? Thank you for coming so quickly when Mr. Pate called you." Henry paused for a moment, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel protected. "I'll always come when you need me, Sarah. Always." The girl nodded, unable to express in words what that promise meant to her. After years of not being able to fully trust anyone, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone she could lean on without reservations. The study room was small but cozy, with large windows that provided a clear view of the street. Sarah immediately positioned herself where she could see the library entrance. "Are you always so cautious?" Henry asked, noticing her strategic posture. "Survival is a hard habit to break," she responded with a small smile. Michael arrived punctually at the library, carrying a worn briefcase. Upon seeing Sarah, he paused for a moment, clearly impacted by the resemblance to Catherine. "Miss Sarah," he greeted formally, slightly inclining his head. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze that Henry had learned to recognize as her way of evaluating people. After a moment, she nodded slightly, apparently satisfied with what she saw. "What did you find?" she asked directly. Michael looked at Henry, who nodded, giving him permission to proceed. From the briefcase, he took out a yellow envelope, its edges worn, suggesting it had been handled many times. "Sister Mary Angela left this before her—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Before her departure. Their documents, photographs, and a letter explaining everything." "Everything?" Henry asked. "Everything," Michael confirmed, carefully opening the envelope. "Sister Mary Angela kept a detailed record. Apparently her conscience wouldn't let her sleep." From inside the envelope, the secrets of 12 years of silence began to emerge. There were receipts for bank transfers, photographs of secret meetings, and most importantly, a handwritten letter detailing the entire operation. "According to this," Michael continued, "the original plan was to keep Sat to Miss Emily in the orphanage only temporarily. Louise had arranged a fake adoption with a family abroad." Henry felt his blood run cold. "They wanted to take her out of the country." "Yes, but something went wrong. The family backed out at the last minute, scared by the legal implications. It was then that Alfred decided to keep her in the orphanage indefinitely." "As insurance," Sarah murmured, her voice strangely calm. "An ace up the sleeve to control Henry." "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "Every time they needed to pressure Mr. Thompson on some business decision, they would leak some clue about her whereabouts. Enough to keep hope alive, but never enough to find her." "But they didn't count on me," Sarah said, and there was a flash of pride in her eyes. "They didn't count on me escaping." "No, they didn't count on that," Michael smiled. "In fact, according to Sister Mary Angela's letter, your escape caused panic. Alfred was furious. Without you as leverage, his plan was crumbling." "Is there anything about Alexandra Vega in those documents?" Henry asked. Michael nodded, pulling out another photograph. "She was more than just a secretary. She was the link between all those involved. She kept the accounts, coordinated communications. She even forged the original adoption documents." "And where is she now?" Sarah asked. "In Queens, living under the name Anna Martinez. But the interesting thing isn't where she is, but who she's in contact with." Michael pulled out another document. "She's still receiving monthly deposits from an account in the Cayman Islands, the same account Alfred uses for his suspicious transactions." Henry stood up and began to pace the small room, processing the information. "So we have evidence, real evidence of the entire conspiracy." "Yes, sir, enough to press legal charges." "But," Sarah interrupted, "if we make a move now, they could destroy more evidence. Or worse, they could flee." Henry and Michael looked at the girl in surprise. Her ability to strategically analyze the situation was impressive. "She's right," Michael said. "We need to be cautious. Especially now that we know they're watching us." "The man in the grey suit," Henry murmured. "Roger Mendez. Alfred's assistant." Michael frowned. "That means they're nervous. They're trying to figure out how much we know." "What do you suggest we do?" Henry asked. It was Sarah who answered. "We should give them something to see." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. "What do you mean?" Henry asked. If they know you found me but they don't know how much we know, we can use that. Make them think I'm just a street kid you're helping out of charity, that we haven't discovered the truth yet. A distraction, Michael nodded, impressed. While they think we're in the dark, we can continue investigating and gathering evidence, Henry completed. Sarah, you're brilliant. The girl shrugged, but a slight blush colored her cheeks at the compliment. It's just survival. On the street, you learn to make people see what you want them to see. The strategy began to be implemented the next day. Henry and Sarah initiated a careful choreography, designed for the eyes that were watching them. They met in public places, always maintaining a respectful but cordial distance, like a kind businessman helping a street child. Caroline also played her part, acting as a tutor hired to help a disadvantaged minor. The classes continued, but now with a dual purpose. While Sarah really advanced in her studies, they also served as a perfect smokescreen. Excellent pronunciation, Caroline praised one morning, as Sarah read a text in English. Through the window, they could see Roger Mendez pretending to read the newspaper on a park bench. Thank you, Sarah replied in the same language, without looking up from the book. Our friend in the grey suit seems bored today. Caroline smiled, continuing the conversation in English. He's been there since 9. Did you notice there are 2 of them now? The woman in the blue dress by the fountain, I saw her. She's not very subtle. At that moment, Sarah's phone, a recent gift from Henry to keep up appearances, vibrated with a message. Michael found something, she whispered, switching back to English. Alexandra Vega has been making frequent calls to England. Caroline visibly tensed. To England, do you think? To London, Sarah confirmed. Where my mother lives. The news was unsettling. Why would Alexandra be contacting Catherine after so many years? The answer came that same afternoon, during dinner at Mrs. Johnson's house. They're nervous, Henry explained as Mrs. Johnson served her famous meatloaf. Michael intercepted a conversation between Alfred and Louise. They suspect Catherine might be planning to return to New York. My mother is coming back. Sarah's voice trembled slightly. We don't know for sure, Henry responded gently, but the mere fact that they consider it a possibility has put them on alert. Why now? Mrs. Johnson asked, sitting down with them at the table. Because Catherine never stopped searching, Henry explained. All these years she's been following leads, contacting private investigators. And recently, one of her contacts in New York mentioned having seen a girl who matched Emily's age and description. Sarah played with her medallion, thoughtful. Does she know you found me? Not yet. I wanted to wait, give you time to adjust before everything gets more complicated, Sarah completed. She paused, considering something. Maybe we should tell her. Everyone at the table looked at her in surprise. Are you sure? Henry asked gently. There's no rush, we can wait until you feel more prepared. It's not for me, Sarah explained. It's for safety. If she's investigating on her own, she could accidentally alert Alfred and the others. She needs to know she should be cautious. Henry felt a wave of pride at his daughter's maturity and insight. You're right. But how do we contact her without raising suspicions? Caroline could call her, Sarah suggested. She was her teacher, it would be natural for them to keep in touch. And if someone is intercepting calls, it would seem like a normal conversation between old friends, Caroline completed, nodding in approval. We could use code, talk about music, about her old students. And meanwhile, Sarah continued, we keep up our act for Roger and his friends. We make them believe I'm just another one of your charity cases. I don't like you exposing yourself like this, Henry said, worry evident in his voice. I'm not exposed, she replied with a small smile. I'm protected. By you, by Caroline, by Mrs. Johnson, by Michael. I have more people looking out for me now than in my entire life. Sarah's words touched something deep in all those present. It was true. In recent weeks, a protection network had formed around her, a circle of trust that contrasted dramatically with her years of solitude on the streets. Besides, she added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, I'm a better actress than they are spies. Years on the street teach you to be invisible when you want, and visible only in the way that suits you. Like a mirror, Mrs. Johnson murmured, reflecting only what others expect to see. Exactly, Sarah nodded. And while they see what they want to see, we continue putting the pieces together, Henry completed. But on one condition, at the first sign of real danger, We change the plan. Your safety comes first." Sarah looked at him for a long time before nodding. "Deal. Now can we eat?" "Mrs. Johnson's meatloaf is getting cold, and it would be a crime to waste something so good." The call to England was made the next day. Caroline, sitting at the piano in her living room with Sarah and Henry listening in silence, dialed the number she had kept all these years. "Catherine? Yes, it's Caroline. No, nothing's wrong. I was thinking about you. Do you remember that melody you composed?" "Yes, the lullaby. I was teaching it to a new student." Sarah held her breath. Even through the phone, she could hear her mother's soft voice, though she couldn't make out the words. "She's a very special girl," Caroline continued, her eyes fixed on Sarah. "She reminds me a lot of you when you were young. She has that same gift for music. And her eyes, they have that particular color, like amber under the sun." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Catherine spoke again, her voice noticeably trembled. "Caroline? What are you trying to tell me?" "Catherine, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and above all, I need you to stay calm. Are you alone?" Yes, I'm in my studio." "Good. Because I have something important to tell you about your lost melody. It has found its way back home." A muffled sob was heard through the phone. "Emily? They found Emily." "Yes, Catherine. She's here, she's safe. But we need to be very careful. There are people who shouldn't know that the score has been found. Do you understand?" "The ones who stole her," Catherine whispered. Are they close?" "Very close. That's why we need you to keep your composure. If anyone asks, this call was just about music, about old students." "I understand," Catherine responded, her voice regaining some control. Is she okay?" Caroline looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "She's incredible, Catherine. Strong, intelligent, brave. She's survived on her own all this time, and yet she still maintains that special light in her eyes. Your light." More sobs on the other end of the line. Is she there now?" Sarah took a step forward, approaching the phone. Caroline looked at her questioningly, and she nodded again. "Hello," she said softly. "It's me. It's Emily." "My baby." Catherine's voice broke completely. "My little one. Your voice, you've grown so much." "I go by Sarah now," she said gently. But I'm starting to remember. The yellow room. The lullaby you sang to me. Every night," Catherine completed through tears. "I sang it to you every night. And when I lost you, I kept singing it, hoping that somehow you could hear it and find your way home." "I heard it," Sarah responded, her own eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know what it was, but it was always there, in my mind, like an echo." Henry approached, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. She, for the first time, didn't tense at the contact. "Catherine," he intervened softly, "we need you to stay calm. Don't make any sudden moves, no changes in your routine. We're close to uncovering the whole truth, but we need time." "I understand," she responded, breathing deeply. "But will I be able to—" "Soon," Henry promised. "Very soon we'll all be together. But it has to be when it's safe." "There are people watching us," Sarah explained. "People who don't want the truth to come to light. That's why we need you to act normally." "My smart girl," Catherine whispered. "So strong, so brave. Will we be able to talk again?" "Through Caroline," Henry responded. "She's our safe contact. But remember, only conversations about music, about the past, nothing that could raise suspicions." The call extended for a few more minutes, with words of contained love, whispered promises, and barely controlled tears. When they finally hung up, Sarah stood motionless, processing the experience of having heard her mother's voice for the first time in 12 years. "Are you okay?" Henry asked softly. "Her voice," Sarah responded in a whisper. "It's exactly as I remembered in my dreams." The conversation with Catherine had stirred something deep in Sarah. That night, as she had dinner at Mrs. Johnson's house, her thoughts kept returning to her mother's voice, to the way she had pronounced her name, to the evident love in every trembling word. "You're eating little, sweetie," Mrs. Johnson observed, interrupting her reflections. "I'm sorry, it's just that—" Sarah hesitated, searching for the words. "Everything seems so unreal, as if I were living someone else's life." Henry, who had decided to stay for dinner with them, watched her with concern. Do you regret having talked to her? No, Sarah responded quickly. It's just that now everything is more real. It's not just me against the world anymore. There are people who depend on me, who can get hurt if I make a mistake. No one is going to get hurt, Henry assured firmly. We have a plan, we have support, and above all we have each other. The sound of a message on Henry's phone interrupted the conversation. It was Michael. Movement in the company. Alfred called an urgent board meeting for tomorrow. What does that mean? Sarah asked, having read the message over her father's shoulder. It means they're nervous, Henry responded. They probably detected the call to England. Can they trace it back here? No, Michael made sure the line was secure, but Alfred has contacts in London. If Catherine shows any change in her behavior, they'll know something has changed, Sarah completed. She paused, thoughtful. We need to give them something else to think about. What do you suggest? A small smile played on Sarah's lips. How about you take me to your company tomorrow? To the company? Henry looked at her surprised. Why? Think about it. A successful businessman helping a street child, showing her a different world, inspiring her to dream of a better future. It's exactly the kind of story they'd expect to see. And while Alfred is busy worrying about your presence in the company, Henry began understanding the plan. Michael can investigate his office without raising suspicions, Sarah completed. Mrs. Johnson observed the exchange with a mixture of pride and concern. You're too smart for your age, sweetie. The street teaches you to think fast, Sarah responded with a shrug, and to see opportunities where others see problems. Henry considered the plan for a moment. It could work. In fact, it would be perfectly natural for me to want to show you the kind of opportunities you could have with education and hard work. Exactly. And knowing Alfred, he'll be so busy trying to figure out if I'm a threat that he won't notice what's happening under his nose. But you'll need appropriate clothes, Mrs. Johnson intervened. For you can't go to an important company with your usual clothes. I'll take care of that, Henry said. Martha can help us with that. Sarah frowned. I don't want you to spend money on... It's part of the plan, Henry interrupted her gently. For it to be believable, we need you to look like a child who's being introduced to a new world. Besides, he added with a smile, what kind of benefactor would I be if I didn't make sure my protégé looked presentable? The way he said protégé, with a touch of irony, made Sarah smile. It was part of their game, their act for the outside world, but it also contained a deeper truth. He was really protecting her, not just physically, but emotionally. Okay, she finally agreed. But nothing too fancy. It has to be believable. Trust Martha, Henry responded. She'll know exactly what's appropriate for a girl who's beginning to transition between two worlds. As they finalized the details of the plan, Sarah couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in such a short time. From living on the streets, depending only on herself, she had become part of a complex operation involving multiple people, each playing their role in an elaborate dance of deceptions and hidden truths. What are you thinking about? Henry asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. That life is strange, she responded. A few weeks ago, my biggest concern was finding a safe place to sleep. Now I'm planning strategies to unmask a corporate conspiracy. Does it scare you? No, she said after a moment of reflection. It makes me feel alive, as if I'm finally doing something bigger than just surviving. The next morning found Sarah in front of the mirror at Martha's house, observing her reflection with a mixture of curiosity and strangeness. The woman had carefully chosen her outfit, a simple but elegant navy blue dress, comfortable but presentable shoes, and her hair pulled back in an elaborate but not ostentatious braid. You look beautiful, Martha said, adjusting the collar of the dress. Like a young lady, but without losing your essence. Sarah touched the soft fabric of the dress, so different from the worn clothes she was used to. It's weird, she admitted, like putting on a costume. Sometimes costumes help us discover parts of ourselves we didn't know existed, Martha responded wisely. Besides, this isn't really a costume. It's just another facet of who you are. Henry, who was waiting in the living room, was left speechless when he saw his daughter come down the stairs. For a moment, the image of Catherine at that same age overlapped with Sarah's, so similar and yet so different. Is it okay? Sarah asked, interpreting his silence as disapproval. You're perfect, he responded, recovering his voice. Exactly as it should be. A girl in transition between two worlds. The trip to the company was made in Henry's car, with Michael at the wheel. During the journey, they went over the details of the plan one more time. "Remember," Henry said, "Alfred will probably try to talk to you. It's important that I act like a street kid, impressed but cautious," Sarah completed. "Not too trusting, but not hostile either. I know, Henry. I've been playing different roles all my life to survive." Thompson Enterprises' corporate building stood imposing against the blue sky of New York City. Sarah observed it through the car window, feigning amazement. Although in reality she was evaluating every detail, the security cameras, the entrances and exits, the flow of people. "Ready?" Henry asked when the car stopped in front of the main entrance. Sarah nodded, instantly adopting a slightly insecure posture, as if she were intimidated by the environment. It was a perfect performance, the street child trying to behave in a world that wasn't hers. The automatic doors opened before them, and the air conditioning greeted them with its artificial coolness. Employees greeted Henry with respect, casting curious glances at the girl accompanying him. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," the receptionist greeted. "Mr. Bennett asked if you could stop by his office when you arrived." "Of course," Henry responded naturally. "Do you mind if I show the building to my young friend first?" "Not at all, sir. Do you need anything brought to you?" "Some hot chocolate, perhaps," she added, addressing Sarah kindly. "Thank you," she responded with calculated shyness, sticking slightly to Henry as if seeking protection. As they toured the facilities, Sarah maintained her act of impressed child, but her eyes registered every important detail: the location of security cameras, escape routes, blind spots. "And this is the conference room," Henry explained, opening a glass door that led to an elegant room with a massive conference table. "It's very big," Sarah commented, her voice perfectly modulated to sound amazed but not excessively enthusiastic. "Mr. Thompson," a voice interrupted the tour. Alfred Bennett was standing in the doorway, his suit impeccable and his smile calculated. "What an interesting surprise." "Alfred," Henry greeted with studied calm, "let me formally introduce you to Sarah. I met her a few weeks ago in the Lower East Side. She's an extraordinary girl." Alfred's eyes studied Sarah intently, looking for something. She maintained her performance, alternating between childish curiosity and instinctive caution. "Delighted," Alfred finally said, extending his hand. Sarah took it briefly, as a street child who has learned to be polite but cautious with strangers would. "Thank you for letting me visit," she murmured, lowering her gaze. "Mr. Thompson has always had a generous heart," Alfred commented, without taking his penetrating eyes off her. "Helping the less fortunate is one of his passions." The slight emphasis on the last word didn't go unnoticed by Sarah, but she maintained her innocent expression. "He's very kind," she responded simply. "He's teaching me that I can dream of a different future." The response seemed to satisfy Alfred, who finally diverted his attention to Henry. "Could we talk for a moment in private? We have some pending matters for this afternoon's meeting." "Of course," Henry agreed. "Sarah, would you mind waiting here for a moment? You can see the city from the window. The view is spectacular." "Sure," she responded, approaching the large windows with apparent interest. As the two men walked away, Sarah maintained her posture of a child distracted by the view, but her ears were attentive to every sound, and her eyes, reflected in the glass, followed every movement in the hallway. The chess game had begun, and she knew that every move had to be perfectly calculated. While Sarah maintained her act in front of the window, Michael silently slid through the corridors of the executive floor. As the company's head of security, his presence didn't raise suspicions, and everyone was too distracted by the unexpected visit of Henry's protégé to notice his movements. In Alfred's office, Michael worked quickly and precisely. His years of experience in investigation allowed him to search without leaving a trace, photographing strategic documents and copying files from the computer while it remained locked, thanks to a special device he had installed weeks ago. Meanwhile, in the conference room adjacent to Alfred's office, Sarah could hear fragments of the conversation between him and her father. "It's a noble gesture, Henry," Alfred was saying, his voice a study in false concern. "But don't you think getting so involved with a street child could be risky? People talk." "Since when have I cared what people say?" Henry responded with studied calm. "Besides, Sarah has potential. With the right education." "Ah yes, I heard you hired Caroline Owens as her tutor." Alfred's tone became sharper, An interesting choice. Sarah maintained her posture of apparent fascination with the city view, but every muscle in her body was tense, attentive to every word, every inflection. Caroline is an excellent teacher, Henry responded, and Sarah is progressing rapidly. I imagine so. She has a familiar air, something in her eyes perhaps. The silence that followed was dense, laden with hidden meanings. Sarah could imagine the tension in her father's posture, the veiled challenge in Alfred's smile. A movement in the reflection of the glass caught her attention. Michael had emerged from Alfred's office and was giving her a discreet signal. Mission accomplished. At that moment, the door to the conference room opened, and Roger, Alfred's assistant, entered. He was visibly surprised to see Sarah. "Oh, excuse me, miss. I didn't know there was anyone here." Sarah turned, perfectly playing the role of shy girl. "Mr. Thompson told me I could wait here." Of course," Roger responded, studying her with barely disguised intensity. "Would you like something to drink? A soda, perhaps?" "No, thank you," she responded, turning her attention back to the window. But through the reflection, she noticed how Roger took out his phone and discreetly took a photo of her before leaving. Minutes later, Henry returned to the room. His face was composed, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Ready to continue the tour?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Thompson," she responded, maintaining her role. "The view is very nice from here." As they walked through the corridors, Sarah noticed that several employees were observing them with poorly disguised curiosity. Some whispered among themselves, others pretended to work while following them with their gaze. "The cafeteria is on the next floor," Henry explained aloud, while in whispers he added, "Michael found something. We need to get out of here soon." Sarah nodded imperceptibly, continuing with her act of a child impressed by the corporate building. Upon reaching the lobby, they encountered Alfred again, who seemed to have been waiting for them. "Leaving already?" he asked with false disappointment. "I was hoping you'd join us for the afternoon meeting, Henry." "I'm sorry, but I promised to take Sarah back in time for her class with Caroline," Henry responded. "You know how teachers are about punctuality." Of course," Alfred smiled, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "It's been a pleasure meeting you, little one. I hope you make good use of this opportunity Henry is giving you." "Thank you, sir," she responded, even managing to blush slightly. "I promise to work very hard." Once in the car, as Michael drove them back, Sarah finally relaxed her posture. "What did you find?" she asked without preamble. "Emails," Michael responded from the driver's seat. "Many, between Alfred and various involved people, including a series of recent communications with someone in London." "Catherine," Henry murmured. "They're monitoring Catherine. And there's more," Michael continued. "I found financial documents that prove the payments to the orphanage, to the Mother Superior, even to some nuns who were suddenly transferred. Like Sister Teresa," Sarah completed, "the one who tried to help me." "Exactly. And there's something else, something that explains why Louise and Alfred worked together on this." "What is it?" father and daughter asked in unison. "A marriage certificate," Michael responded, "from 15 years ago. Apparently, Louise and Alfred were briefly married before he married his current wife. In the safety of Caroline's house, the group gathered to analyze the day's discoveries. Sarah, already changed into her usual clothes, felt more like herself as they studied the documents Michael had retrieved. "So Louise and Alfred were married," Caroline reflected, serving them tea. "That explains many things." "The marriage ended badly," Michael explained, spreading more documents on the table. "According to these papers, Louise lost a baby in the 7th month of pregnancy. After that, the relationship deteriorated rapidly. Sarah, who had been unusually silent, finally spoke. That's why they chose me. It wasn't just about controlling Henry and the company. It was personal." "What do you mean?" Henry asked. "Think about it," she responded, her eyes shining with understanding. "Louise lost her baby, and shortly after, you and Catherine had a perfectly healthy daughter, a child that represented everything she had lost. And Alfred," Caroline continued, following the reasoning, "saw an opportunity to combine personal revenge with professional benefit." "But there's something that doesn't fit," Henry intervened. "Why keep you in the orphanage?" "Why not?" He stopped, unable to complete the dark thought. "Because they needed me alive," Sarah responded with a maturity that made everyone's hearts ache. "Alive and within reach. I was their insurance." their way of controlling you. And for Louise, maybe it was her twisted way of having the daughter she lost. The emails confirm it, Michael added. There are messages where Louise insisted on receiving regular reports about your development, your grades at the orphanage, even your health status. The woman in grey, Sarah murmured. That's why she came to observe me, but never spoke to me. She couldn't risk me recognizing her later. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone processed the magnitude of the conspiracy and its emotional ramifications. There's more, Michael said, pulling out another document. I found regular transfers to a Swiss account in the name of a certain Mercedes Ordóñez. Does that name ring a bell, Sarah? The girl visibly paled. She was the orphanage nurse. The one who was always present when Louise came to see me. The one who gave me a syrup to sleep on those nights. Henry clenched his fists tightly. They drugged you for Louise's visits. Probably to prevent you from clearly remembering those moments, Caroline explained gently. Young children are more susceptible to the effects of mild sedatives. And what do we do now? Sarah asked. We have the evidence, but we have to be careful about how we use it, Henry completed. Not just for immediate safety, but because this could have serious legal repercussions. And there's Catherine, Caroline added. If we make a false move and Alfred feels cornered, he could try something against her in London, Sarah concluded, surprising everyone with her quickness to understand the implications. Exactly, Michael nodded. We need to coordinate all movements with precision. Make sure that when we act, they don't have time to react. Sarah got up and walked to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys without pressing them. We need them to make a mistake, she finally said, something that makes them reveal their game. What do you suggest? Henry asked, recognizing the strategic gleam in his daughter's eyes. They're obsessed with control, she responded, turning to look at them. And now they feel they're losing it. My appearance in your life, the classes with Caroline, the possibility of Catherine returning, all of that is destabilizing them. And destabilized people make mistakes, Michael completed, understanding. Exactly. So maybe, Sarah paused, carefully considering her next words. Maybe it's time to increase the pressure. Increase the pressure? Henry asked, studying his daughter's face with a mixture of pride and concern. What do you have in mind? Sarah sat down again, her eyes shining with determination. We need to make them believe they're losing control of the situation, but in a way they can't directly counterattack. How? Caroline asked. First, Sarah began, we need the news of my existence to leak in the company, but not as Henry's lost daughter, but as his charity project. The rumors will spread on their own. It's already happening, Michael confirmed. After your visit today, the hallways are a hotbed of speculation. Good. Second, Caroline needs to be more visible in her visits to the company. Let people see her. Let them remember her connection to Catherine. I can schedule some meetings with the Human Resources Department, Henry suggested, to discuss educational programs for street youth. Perfect, Sarah nodded. And third, we need Catherine to do something unexpected in London, something that makes them nervous but seems completely innocent. Like what? Caroline asked. Like announcing her return to teaching, Sarah responded with a small smile. After years of seclusion, Henry Thompson's widow finally returns to public life, giving music lessons to underprivileged children. Brilliant, Michael murmured. It's the kind of news that would attract local press attention without raising obvious suspicions. But that would put Alfred and Louise on high alert, Henry completed, understanding the plan, because they would know it's not a coincidence. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And when they're nervous, they'll start communicating more among themselves, making mistakes. And Michael will be able to intercept those communications, Caroline added. There's more, Sarah continued. I need to go back to the streets. No, Henry interrupted her abruptly. It's too dangerous. Not permanently, she explained patiently, but I need to maintain my contacts there. Street people see things, hear conversations, notice patterns. If Alfred or Louise send someone to investigate my past, your friends on the street could warn us, Michael completed, impressed by the girl's insight. Besides, Sarah added with a mischievous smile, it would be suspicious if a street kid completely abandoned her territory overnight. I need to maintain my routine, at least in appearance. Henry looked at her for a long time before speaking. How did you become such a strategist? The street is the best school of strategy there is, she responded simply. You learn to read people, to anticipate their moves, to use their expectations against them. It's a good plan, Michael admitted, but it will need precise coordination. And additional protection, Henry added. I don't want you to be really alone at any time. Mr. Pete, Mrs. Johnson, the shoe shiner, the bakery lady, they're all my eyes on the street, Sarah explained. And now I have something I never had before. A phone and people to call if something happens. Caroline stood up and began to pace the room, thoughtful. We could also use the music lessons as part of the plan. If I start teaching you the lullaby Catherine composed, the news would reach Alfred's ears, Sarah completed. Another piece of the puzzle that would make them doubt. But we have to be extremely careful, Michael warned. One false step and everything could crumble. That's why we need every move to seem natural, innocent, Sarah responded. Like pieces of a puzzle coming together by chance. Henry observed his daughter with a mixture of admiration and concern. In a short time, she had gone from being a street child to the main strategist in a complex operation. But beneath that facade of strength and cunning, she was still a 12-year-old girl who had had to grow up too fast. There's something else we need to consider, he finally said. What if it works? If we get all the evidence we need? The repercussions will be enormous, not just for Alfred and Louise, but for you too. Your identity, your story, everything will come to light. Sarah remained silent for a moment, considering the implications. I know, she finally responded, but I'm not the scared girl from the orphanage anymore. I'm not even just the street kid you met a few weeks ago. I'm both, and I'm also your daughter. And it's time for everyone to know it. The following day saw Sarah's plan unfold with calculated precision. Like a perfectly rehearsed choreography, each participant played their part to perfection. Catherine, in London, had given an interview to a small local newspaper about her return to teaching. Music saved me in my darkest moments, she declared, her words carefully chosen. Now I want to use that healing power to help other children find their way. In New York, the news spread quickly in business circles. Michael, monitoring Alfred's communications, recorded a significant increase in international calls. Sarah maintained her delicate balance between two worlds. In the mornings, she attended her classes with Caroline, where she now openly practiced Emily's lullaby on the piano. In the afternoons, she returned to the streets, maintaining her usual routines, but now with a deeper purpose. There's a man asking questions, Mr. Pete informed her one afternoon. He wants to know how long we've known you, if you've always been around here. What does he look like? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Expensive suit, shiny shoes, but tries to look casual. He's not fooling anyone around here. Roger, she murmured. He's trying to verify my story. Information flowed in both directions. The market vendors, the shoe shiners, even the children playing in the square, had all become unwitting informants, alerting about any suspicious presence in the neighborhood. At the company, Henry maintained his act of generous benefactor, occasionally mentioning Sarah's progress in casual meetings. It's amazing what these kids can achieve when given a chance, he would comment, noticing how Alfred tensed his jaw every time the subject came up. Caroline had begun to visit the company regularly, supposedly to discuss the implementation of a music program for vulnerable youth. Music has the power to heal deep wounds, she said in a meeting, looking directly at Alfred. Sometimes a simple melody can awaken memories we thought were lost. The tension was palpable. Alfred began to make small mistakes, misplaced documents, forgotten meetings, hasty decisions. His assistant Roger spent more and more time out of the office, following leads that only led him to dead ends. One afternoon, while Sarah was helping at Mrs. Johnson's stand, she noticed something unusual. An elegant woman observing her from a nearby cafe. It wasn't Louise, but there was something in her posture that caught her attention. "Michael," she whispered into the phone while pretending to organize fruit. "There's someone new in the game, a woman around 50, beige dress, pearl necklace. She's at the Rose Cafe." "I see her," Michael responded, who maintained a discreet surveillance. "It's Beatrice Bennett, Alfred's current wife." Sarah processed this information while continuing her work. "Why would she come herself? Why not send Roger as always?" "Because they're losing control," Michael responded. "Each day that passes, their certainties crumble a little more." That night at dinner at Mrs. Johnson's house, the group met to assess the situation. "Beatrice Bennett is involved now," Michael reported. I intercepted a call between her and Alfred. She's worried about the legal implications if everything comes to light. Apparently, she knew something about the original plan. How many more people are involved? Henry asked, frustration evident in his voice. That's the interesting thing, Sarah responded, who had been unusually silent. Each new person who gets involved is another crack in their wall of secrets. And cracks, she added with a small smile, eventually become fractures. Catherine called. Caroline intervened. The press in London is showing interest in her story. Some journalists have started investigating her past, asking about her time in New York. Perfect, Sarah said. That will make them even more nervous. And when people are nervous, they make mistakes, Henry completed, looking at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. But they can also become dangerous. That's why we need to be ready, she responded. The moment is approaching. I can feel it. Outside, night was falling over New York City, and with it the sense that a storm was approaching. A storm that threatened to expose long-buried secrets and change lives forever. The decisive moment came unexpectedly, as great changes in life often do. On an apparently normal morning, Michael burst into Caroline's house during Sarah's piano lesson. "We've got it," he announced without preamble. Alfred made a mistake. A big mistake. Henry, who had been working from there to be close to his daughter, stood up immediately. What happened? Panic, Michael responded, deploying his laptop on the piano. Beatrice threatened to expose everything if he didn't give her a satisfactory explanation about the money he keeps sending to the Cayman Islands. In response, Alfred tried to transfer a large amount of money this morning, but in his rush, a smile spread across his face. He used the corporate network instead of his private connection. "And you were able to track it," Sarah completed, her fingers still on the piano keys. "Better than that. I have the emails he exchanged with the bank, where he explicitly explains the origin of the funds and their purpose. Silencing everyone involved in my kidnapping," Sarah murmured. "Exactly. And there's more." In his panic, he called Louise from his company phone. Henry leaned over the laptop, reading quickly. "The entire conversation is recorded. They confessed everything," Michael confirmed. Louise especially. When Alfred accused her of being careless with the visits to the orphanage, well, let's say she didn't hold anything back. Sarah stood up from the piano, her expression serious. "And now what?" "Now," Henry responded, "we have to move fast. Michael has already sent copies of all the evidence to the authorities and our lawyers, but we need to keep you safe. Alfred and Louise, when they realize—" "I'm not going to hide," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I've been hiding all my life. It's time to face the truth." Caroline, who had been listening in silence, intervened. "Sarah is right. Hiding her now would only give them more power." "Then let's make it public," Michael suggested, "before they can react." "A press conference?" "No," Sarah said, surprising everyone. "Something more personal, more meaningful." She went to the piano and began to softly play Emily's lullaby. The melody, which she now mastered perfectly, filled the room with its bittersweet notes. "The charity gala," she finally said. "The one Alfred has been organizing to show the charitable side of the company." Henry looked at her with dawning understanding. "It's this Friday. The entire board of directors will be there," Sarah continued. "The press, important shareholders, and Alfred won't be able to do anything without exposing himself," Michael completed. "It's brilliant. But we need one more element," Sarah added, letting her fingers caress the last notes of the melody. "We need my mother there." A silence fell over the room. Catherine was in London, and bringing her without alerting Alfred would seem impossible. But Sarah smiled. "She's already on her way, isn't she?" she asked, looking at Henry. He nodded. "She arrived this morning. She's at a hotel waiting for the right moment." "How did you know?" Caroline asked, surprised. "The sheet music," Sarah responded, pointing to the music sheets on the piano. "They appeared yesterday, handwritten. Only she could have the original score of my lullaby." "You're amazing," Henry murmured, marveling once again at his daughter's insight. "No," she responded with a small smile. "I'm just a girl who learned to observe everything to survive, and now—" She stood up from the piano, her posture emanating an iron determination. "Now it's time to use those skills for something more than just surviving. It's time to really live." Michael began typing on his laptop, preparing everything. Caroline headed to the phone to coordinate with Catherine. Henry approached his daughter, and for the first time she allowed him to hug her completely. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded against his chest. "I've been ready all my life. I just didn't know it until now." Outside, the afternoon sun bathed New York City in golden tones, as if nature itself wanted to illuminate the moment when a long-separated family would finally reunite, and the truth, so long buried, would come to light. The ballroom of the Imperial Hotel sparkled with golden lights for Thompson Enterprises' charity gala. New York's business elite mingled with political figures and celebrities, all supposedly gathered to support programs helping street children. Alfred Bennett, impeccable in his black tuxedo, moved among the guests with the confidence of someone who feels in control. However, his eyes didn't stop scanning the entrance, especially since he had seen Caroline Owens arrive. In the center of the room, a black grand piano waited silently. According to the program, a young musical prodigy would offer a special presentation. "Beautiful evening," Beatrice Bennett commented to her husband, her tense smile betraying her nervousness. "Although I don't see Henry anywhere." "He'll arrive," Alfred responded dryly. He wouldn't miss the opportunity to show off his latest charity project. As if his words had summoned him, Henry Thompson made his entrance, but he wasn't alone. At his side, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, walked Sarah. Her black hair was pulled back in a soft bun, and the silver medallion shone on her neck. A murmur ran through the room. Many had heard rumors about the street girl that Henry Thompson had taken under his protection, but seeing her like this, transformed and elegant, was something else. "Good evening, Alfred," Henry greeted with studied calm. "Beatrice, allow me to formally introduce you to Sarah." "We've already met," Alfred responded, his smile not reaching his eyes. "From the office, remember?" "Oh, we know each other from much earlier," Sarah said, her voice clear and firm. "From St. Angel's Orphanage, to be precise." The color drained from Alfred's face. Before he could respond, the lights in the room dimmed, and Caroline approached the microphone next to the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "tonight we have a very special presentation. A unique piece composed 12 years ago by a mother for her daughter." The murmurs in the room increased when Sarah headed towards the piano, but it was the next entrance that caused commotion. Catherine Thompson, as elegant and beautiful as ever, appeared at the entrance of the ballroom. "Impossible," Alfred whispered, taking a step back. Sarah began to play. The notes of Emily's lullaby filled the room, but this time it wasn't just a melody, it was a statement. Each note, each chord, told a story of loss, love, and reunion. Catherine walked slowly towards the piano, silent tears running down her cheeks. When she reached her daughter's side, she began to softly sing the lyrics she had composed so long ago. "Sleep, my child, sleep, my son." Alfred tried to move towards the exit, but found himself surrounded by police officers who had been discreetly positioned among the guests. The music continued as Michael, accompanied by more officers, escorted a woman who had just arrived, Louise, who had been intercepted trying to board a flight to Europe. When the last note faded away, the silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood up from the piano and, for the first time in 12 years, hugged her mother. Henry joined them, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still as the Thompson family finally reunited. "Mr. Bennett," an officer's voice broke the moment, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy." As the officers read Alfred and Louise their rights, camera flashes illuminated the scene. The story would be in all the newspapers the next day. Thompson heiress found, a story of love, loss, and redemption. But for Sarah, none of that mattered at that moment. In her parents' arms, with the silver medallion beating against her chest like a second heart, she was finally home. "How did you know it would work?" Catherine whispered, caressing her daughter's face. "Because music never lies," Sarah responded with a smile. "And this melody was always our story, waiting to be told." In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Sarah Thompson, the girl who survived on the streets without forgetting the lullaby her mother sang to her, touched all of New York. But beyond the headlines and interviews, a family was rebuilding itself, healing deep wounds and learning to be whole again. St. Angel's Orphanage was investigated and reformed. Henry established a foundation to help street children, with Sarah as its most passionate advocate. Catherine returned to New York permanently, and the music lessons with Caroline continued, now with mother and daughter playing together. And every night before going to sleep, in the room that had waited 12 years for her return, Sarah played Emily's lullaby on the piano that Henry had specially installed for her. But it was no longer a melody of loss and longing, but a celebration of love, family, and the healing power of music. Because some stories, like some melodies, are destined to find their way home no matter how long it takes.